Under the common law, the idea of a third-party contract beneficiary is really a contradiction in terms because of the doctrine of privity. That is, the idea that only parties to the contract have rights and obligations under it, and strangers to a contract have neither rights nor responsibilities. Well, that's changed some, certainly in the United States, and today we're going to be looking at the restatement of contracts and how the rule has evolved as reflected in that provision. Under Section 302 of the restatement, you've got the basic definitions of intended and incidental beneficiaries. Now, intended beneficiaries are third parties that do have some sort of rights under a contract to which they're strangers. Incidental beneficiaries don't. And within the category of intended beneficiaries, you've got two possibilities. In this slide, we see 1A. In the next slide, we're going to see 1B. Both of those are intended beneficiaries. So what's common to both is that the beneficiary is intended if the parties to the contract, the formal parties to the contract, intend to give the intended beneficiary a right of performance. What that means basically is if the formal parties to the contract intend that a third party have some right of performance, that is to say the right to require one of the parties to the contract to perform an obligation for the third party's benefit, then they are an intended beneficiary, provided that either A or B is also true. So 302.1, just this first bit, tells you that to be an intended beneficiary, you have to be so intended by the parties to the contract. They have to intend that you be a beneficiary. And either possibility A, performance of whatever the promise is that the right to performance refers to, will satisfy an obligation of the promisee, that is the one to whom the promise is made, to pay money to the beneficiary. Okay, we unpack that a little bit. What that's about is what used to be called a creditor beneficiary. So, for example, if there's a debt that I owe to a third party, and you promise me that you will pay that debt, and there's, for whatever reason, and you agree to do that, there's a contract between us such that you have agreed to pay the debt that I owe to some third party. Okay, and we both intend that that third party have the right to go after you if you don't pay that debt. That third party would be an intended beneficiary under 302.1a, because we both intend that the third party have the right to your performance of the promise, and performance of that promise will satisfy an obligation of mine as the promisee of your promise to pay money to that third party. Okay, the next category of intended beneficiary under 302.1b is what used to be referred to as a donee beneficiary. The threshold requirement under Section 1 is the same, that the parties to the formal contract have to intend to give the third party the benefit of the promised performance, and B, the circumstances indicate that the promisee intends to give the beneficiary the benefit of the promised performance. Okay, so the difference between A and B is simply that to be a 302.1a third-party beneficiary, the promisee, party to the contract, has to owe money to the third party. Under 302.1b, that's not required. All that's required is that the promisee intend to give the beneficiary the benefit of the promise under the contract. Okay, now that's a little abstract. We're going to have an example of that in a minute, but a classic example is in a construction context, a payment bond where a contractor and a surety promise to the owner that the surety and contractor will make sure that all of the subcontractors and suppliers get paid, essentially. And in that context, the promisee is the owner, and the contractor slash surety on the project are the ones making the promise. They're the promisors, and both the promisors and the promisee intend to give the unpaid subcontractors and suppliers, who are third parties, the benefit of the contractor slash surety's promise that they'll all get paid. It's not that the owner owes money to the subcontractors and suppliers. If that were the case, this would be a 3021A situation. But that's not the case in my hypothetical. So just hang on to that, because we're going to come back to an example in a minute that may make that a little clearer. And just to kind of close the loop, Section 302.2 just says, okay, if you're not an intended beneficiary, right, if you don't fit within the requirements of 3021A or 3021B, then you're an incidental beneficiary. And incidental beneficiaries have no rights or obligations under contracts to which they're not parties. So being an incidental beneficiary is a bad thing if you're trying to as a stranger to a contract, trying to get the benefit of it. If you can fit within the intended beneficiary categories, then you may have a right to somebody's performance, even though you're not a party to the contract. Okay, so an illustration. This is illustration 12 from Section 302. B contracts to build a house for A. Pursuant to the contract, B and his surety execute a payment bond, A, by which they promise A that all of B's debts for labor and materials on the house will be paid. B later employs C as a carpenter and buys lumber from D. C and D are intended beneficiaries of S's promise to A, whether or not they have power to create liens on the house. Okay, what all that means, that's essentially the example I was giving a minute ago of a Section 302(1)B kind of intended third-party beneficiary. B is the contractor, S is the surety. B is going to build the house. B, the contractor, goes out and employs a carpenter, who's a subcontractor, and D, a supplier. And under the terms of the payment bond, right, that's the formal contract, and the parties to that contract are A, B, and S, the owner, the contractor, and the surety. Under the terms of that contract, the contractor and the surety promise to the owner that the contractor's debts for labor and materials will be paid. Okay, so D and C, they're both strangers to this payment bond. Nevertheless, because A, B, and S all intend to give C and D the benefit of the promised performance, namely this promise that all of B's debts for labor and materials will be paid, C and D are both intended third-party beneficiaries, and it's clear that A intends to give them the benefit of that performance of that promise, right? A is the promisee. A is the owner, who's the recipient of the promise from the contractor and the surety. But the owner, for its own interests, wants to make sure that the subcontractors and suppliers are paid, even though the owner doesn't itself owe the money to the subcontractors and suppliers, because the owner doesn't have any contract with the subcontractors and suppliers. The owner only has a contract with the contractor. So this isn't a 3021A situation, because the performance of this promise that all of B's debts for labor and materials will be paid won't satisfy an obligation of the owner to pay money to the subcontractors and suppliers. All the owner has an obligation to pay is the contractor. Nevertheless, it is a 302(1)(b) situation because the owner, as I say, for its own reasons, wants to give the unpaid subcontractors and suppliers the benefit of the contractor's and surety's promise to pay the contractor's debts. Why would the owner want to do that? Well, one reason is that unpaid subcontractors and suppliers, at least on private construction projects, can file liens against the property, which basically is like a kind of security interest in the property. And that becomes a cloud on the title of the real property that the owner has, and so it becomes a headache for the owner, even though the owner's not itself liable for the debt directly. So that's one reason why an owner would want to have a payment bond. As this illustration makes clear, though, whether or not the C and D have lien rights is not essential. The owner may have other reasons for not wanting to have subcontractors and suppliers go unpaid. For example, the owner doesn't want them to stop work because of some dispute between themselves, and that is the subcontractor, supplier, and the general contractor, which happens a lot, right? That subcontractors and suppliers get in disputes with the general contractor, they lay down their tools and walk off the job, and that then becomes a different kind of headache for the owner. Okay, so third-party beneficiaries, basically intended third-party beneficiaries fall into two groups, either what used to be called creditor beneficiaries under 302(1)(a) or donee beneficiaries under 302(1)(b), but they have the common feature that they have the rights to performance of some contractual obligation, even though they themselves are not parties to the contract. And that's an evolution in the common law that has watered down the doctrine of privity of contract.